Every episode, we meet with a community leader, a researcher, a great architect, or a developer to discuss issues that's concerned with cities. How can we reimagine our cities? How can we make our cities more prosperous and create a better future for our children and the next generation? How do we find solutions for problems that we currently have with health, social justice, the environment, all these things. So today I have with me Dr. Vaghn Horn, who has a PhD from Harvard University, who is currently working as a client rep, and he's, of course, a licensed architect. I know for how many years? 20?
Yeah, it's been 10 years now since I got my license. It took me longer than that, almost about that long to even get it.
So I've been reading Vaughn's research, and it's mind-blowing. I'll let Vaghn introduce himself and talk a bit about himself before I grill him with questions about his research and about how do we create a better future for our children.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for having me on this chat. And it's good to see you, after we had worked together, colleagues there at the Boston Architectural College. So it's good to see that you're still doing great things there. For me, the long and the short of it, I'm originally from Los Angeles, California. Most of my career path has been a combination of practical or working in the practice, as well as academic endeavors, as well as consulting, as well as being an entrepreneur, having my own business, and then now working as a senior project manager on the owner side of the equation. On the client side has been illuminating, to say the least. So it's throughout my career, research has also been a very integral part, and not just research in a vacuum, research in the sense of working with people and listening to people that helps me guide what I might find the topics of interest that need more investigation. And part of what I had shared with you, Isra, was a piece that I wrote about workforce housing in Cuba. And that was after a conference that I attended at Harvard called Cuba Facing Forward. And it was about how does a nation in transition embrace multiple aspects of economic development that are tied into the politics of being a citizen of Cuba, plus the history of how Cuba's economy has evolved, and in some ways where it intersects, and how I made a comparison to what's happening in Boston neighborhoods. So that was a very exciting piece, and that actually was sort of fodder for what eventually was my dissertation, which was about cities in the very broadest sense, but about public housing and how it fits into the sphere of its design aspects, as well as its political reach, as well as its social meaning, and how those all tie together have all been part of what has inspired me to continue to look at cities from the macro scale and then dive into sort of the micro scale level of thinking when it comes to either specific neighborhoods or specific projects and specific periods of time that I like to call cultural moments. And these cultural moments are very much tied to things that affect our everyday activities as architects. I would say not just citizens, but as scholars of what's going on and interpreters of how the designs that we create or are surrounded by have these effects on people and how they reflect what people believe in at the time and how they can also evolve over time. But that's the long and the short of it. Didn't want to take too much on my intro. There you have it.
Thank you very much. So I know from when we worked together that you had bachelor's degree and master's degree and doctorates all about housing. Am I right?
It's funny how it all ended up working out that way. In undergrad, my thesis project in fifth year ended up being about elderly housing, about assisted living. That was not what my aim was going in. I wanted something a little bit more sexy, if you will, in terms of design. But what I learned from that was about accessibility and social justice, and how some of those aspects had not been part of the design discourse on senior living as they should have been. I think they are now. I think the light is a lot brighter. For my master's degree at Syracuse, the project that we had was a two-part project, but the main piece, what I tried to do was look at housing in the aftermath of a major event such as the Olympics. What happens to if, say, a city like Florence, Italy were to host the Olympics? You would build this housing where would you put people as soon as the Olympics were done? What implications would that have on the neighborhood? Because it'd be essentially athletes' housings and the Olympic Village become neighborhoods to themselves. That was something that just kind of was a reaction to a design exercise that we had where I wanted to add a thematic approach. What we were given was a skeletal outline of housing in an urban setting, but I said, well, let's look at something that's vital, where you have even what's happening now in Tokyo is each location that the Olympics occurs in, there's an intense housing component. And at the time I was in school, it was about Greece and what was happening, the outcome or the outlook that some of the athletes' housing would just be defunct and sort of die out in this field where it was once vibrant and very necessary. Even as a design research, potential future research project, we could even look at how are the former Olympic housing complexes being used today? Are there opportunities to put people back in those places? They're dormitory style, so it's really certain limitations that you have, but are there things that can be retrofitted to suit today's needs? And then with my project for Harvard, my dissertation, I sort of landed organically on public housing. My initial ideas coming into the school were about deindustrialization and deindustrialized cities, such as Detroit and parts of the Rust Belt in the United States. And what I found as a common thread to industries leapfrogging and shutting down mills and warehouses and all these modes of production had strong effects tied to housing. I started to look at in a very sharp way, if you will, and seeing sort of the acute needs for affordable housing, but also neighborhood aspects that allowed people that were tied to the industries to have a sense of family life, to have these idealistic thoughts and sort of, aspects of living in a city kind of come about through their work and through where they live. It's interesting how those three stages in my education all kind of landed on the same topic.
So I'm going to start our discussion digging deeper by asking you to explain to the viewers what is gentrification and why architects and planners are warning cities and developers and the public about it.
Yeah, it's a loaded term. It's, in my mind, if you look at theoretically what gentrification has been written about and explained, it has to do with people and processes. So if we distill it down to those basics, maybe it piques the viewer's interest and say, okay, go on. What are you really saying? What I'm saying is that there's intro or an entryway and an exit that affects people and is exacerbated by processes. Gentrification, in my mind, is the deliberate act of intensifying land use for the sake of enabling one segment of a population to thrive while showing another segment of the population the exit door, making an entry for one at the expense of another. Now, that sounds a little bit macabre, but that's sort of a practical way and sort of a skeptical way of looking at it, I can admit. But I'm looking for, in my own work, ways that gentrification, where you're looking at neighborhood betterment and overall quality of life improvements that benefit everyone. That part I could imagine might be a naive approach in the view of some, but I acknowledge that there's multiple points of view on that. Where I stand on my point of view, and I would love to have any sort of discourse with anybody of a different opinion, is that the entryway for one group to thrive comes at the expense of, you could call it an indigenous group, or anyone who was there before may or may not have the chance of the thriving group in whatever is being built or changed. That land use intensification is key to this, because the people driving it kind of change what we might view as gentrification. Is gentrification existing if the community themselves pull their own resources together and make the land use intensification work for their benefit? Is that a thing? Or are we solely talking about an outside entity, a developer or some sort of other company, maybe even a city and a broader initiative for economic development? Does that constitute the sole definition of gentrification? That is a nebulous term. And I think for how I've looked at it both ways. And what I found is sort of grassroots approach has not been called gentrification. If one were to have a community an existing community do for themselves, some self-help, if you will, and mutual aid. It's called just that. It's not called gentrification. So the gentrification piece comes with literally the word gentry embedded in it. And in many ways, we never quite achieve that architecturally if we're comparing it to a specific style. But what it does mean socially and economically, there's many examples, especially in the city of Boston, that could point to the definition that I brought up in the very beginning. Sort of the entry and the exit, the people and the processing.
We're back with a new researcher.
I know.
Mary.
This is Harlow, everyone. Hey, baby.
Hello. Yeah, so she's gonna chime in every once in a while to correct Daddy, maybe, or
That's
Adam. My next question would be, I know that the Havana idea came from a conference you just said, picked Havana and East Boston to compare. What are the characteristics that made you compare the two?
That's a good question. I think I mentioned just briefly that my experience, I haven't even gone to Havana yet. So I was asked to write this piece by the conference organizers for the Cuba conference, the Cuba Facing Forward. At the time, my research was broad and it was tied to neighborhoods. And I was looking at the housing aspects here in Boston and how they interact with sort of grassroots efforts to make housing better. So I landed on the South End, and I had been studying the South End for over a year, spent a lot of time at archives at Northeastern and also at the South End Library. If anyone's been on the second floor, they have a closet full of stuff if you just want to look at it. It talks about everything from Tent City to Via Victoria. So where I landed on that and the comparison was I found the Via Victoria case very interesting. You had a community designer, John Sherritt, who, when you talk about community design, it's code word in architecture for pro bono or drastically reduced rates. For him, John Sherritt, I had a chance to interview him and to talk about the Via Victoria project and the sort of things that he was leaning toward in terms of even engaging with the Via Victoria, with EVA, which was the organization that was running Via Victoria. Those things were all appealing to me, especially for my own practice, but also for my own research. But what I found with that specific housing project at Via Victoria was the community, like I was saying before, do you call it gentrification when the community does it? The community became and took sort of the reins and said, we want to control our own destiny. We want to control where our people, if you will, being very territorial and direct about it, where they might land. Where might the Puerto Rican population and others land in Boston in an era where land is being taken and used for various purposes that often didn't involve the community. So when the community took it upon themselves to create the conditions by saying, we're going to raise the money, we're going to get the seed money and follow all the rules that a developer would, and including incorporating like a development corporation, doing all of these steps, I thought was very intriguing, and it had interesting parallels but some drastic differences to how things work in Cuba. And what I wanted to explain in the Cuba portion was that the self-help piece was tied to a philosophical way of governing, where it was almost implied by being a Cuban national that you would want to do for the betterment of all Cubans just by being a Cuban. Not in America, it just works a little bit differently. Some people might claim that, and even some Bostonians in the South End, or even in Via Victoria, they might say this is for the benefit of all. It's hard to suss out what's true about that. But when it's tied to sort of a political economy, as it is in Cuba, having everyday workers be the construction labor for housing, I thought was just avant-garde. It's something you just don't see in America. You don't see it in Boston. You didn't see it in Via Victoria. You didn't see at Via Victoria when that housing development and entire economic development was occurring. You didn't see everyday folks in exchange for their efforts, instead of getting paid, they received a house. In Cuba, the workers were paid by the satisfaction of knowing that they contributed to the national economy and to the betterment of all, if you will. And the other piece was that they were also inspired and driven by the fact that at the end of this, they got their own house. So that's just a dynamic that we just don't have here. I just thought it was fascinating to compare and contrast those stories. And then, underneath that I didn't really get a chance to articulate was kind of the entryway and the exit kind of dynamic that I was talking about at the very beginning. Who benefits, who builds, who will live there? These are like fundamental questions that I think in the article, I tried to at least point to more research needed to be done if you fully understand that. Whereas in Cuba, and this is for the Boston part, Cuba part, it was very clear that it was workforce housing built by workers. So with some reluctant encouragement for the government to do so in Cuba. But once things were aligned so that the construction could happen, it produced some pretty dynamic results that many of those projects still stand up today. That kind of, hopefully that answers the question, but it was really to create a nice dynamic piece about comparing and contrasting the two settings.
So probably I have a bit of an idea what we're learning from the Cuba experience, but what can Cuba learn from the East Boston experience?
That's kind of where the article left off, really, and where the book, Cuba Facing Forward, it's out on Amazon now. There's many pieces of what can sort of a reflexive process, right? What could Cuba teach certain neighborhoods, and what could certain neighborhoods and neighborhood dynamics learn from Cuba? The part where if we were to say, on the one hand, what could we learn from Cuba? We could learn that self-help and mutual aid will sustain cities. It's a currency with no expiration date, no inflation. You can't put inflation on someone's willingness to help, someone's willingness to administer mutual aid. That is timeless, right? That's survival. That's the essence of sustainability. So that's how I truly think about those two dynamics working. Now, in terms of economics, there's things that Cuba's housing system could learn from Boston's specific case of Via Victoria, but those would come with political ramifications. To have a grassroots effort to become a developer would cut against how things are done in such a drastic way that there might be political ramification. So you really, do you want to, and we're seeing it now with some unrest in Cuba, is the state has, tried to shut down, the Cuban government has shut down even how people communicate. And that's the ramification that if you were to have a grassroots movement, that's what Cubans are confronted with. That's drastically different than anything that would ever happen in the South. If we were to have Mayor Walsh to have even our governor, Charlie Baker, say, let's shut down the internet because of protests, I mean, that would just be something that would go against our constitutional rights. Whereas in Cuba, it's not right, and it's not humane for some of the treatment that I've seen, even read about. But it's totally par for the course for that kind of government. So what we can learn from each other is that the concerns are all shared, and the intensity to want to do something, the interest to want to do something about it transcends borders. It's just how do you execute it, and what do you label it? That's kind of my take on that.
That's an excellent one. If you were asked to advise developers in the Boston area or Boston City on how to create a better city in terms of health, social justice, promoting better economic health for middle class and low income class. That's not for the city, that's for developers. In the same time where developers can thrive and make profit, what would you advise them? And I think you're right now a client rep, right? You're in kind of that position.
Yeah, it's layered in my mind in terms of what constitutes better. For us to say better or bettering would mean acknowledging that there are problems. So my advice would be for anyone pursuing that path, pick a side and say, I acknowledge that there are problems and I'm on that side. And I would say align resources of like-minded individuals that might help you see that way, but also align yourselves with people who see it the other way, that everything is fine the way it is, to help you create a balanced sense of what betterment could become. That's one thing. The other, let's say there's four measures or heuristics that would get us there. The second one, if we're saying acknowledging that there's a problem, the second one would be that defining what will take the lead in terms of a betterment strategy. Let's take, for instance, if we're still looking at Boston, let's take Chinatown and transit-oriented development in Chinatown. Transit-oriented development in Chinatown has been the lead dog, if you will. If you look at it like a sled, like if you're doing the Iditarod and you need a lead dog, what's the lead? What do you call the lead? Is the lead transit-oriented development like it is in many, many, many places from LA to Boston and beyond? You want to figure out what that is and what constitutes betterment in that regard. Is it making the transit system work better? Is it making the things that are aligned with the transit, like housing in and around where transit stations are? It gets complicated, but that's where you want to pick a side so you don't drive yourself crazy. But you can also come up with an answerable question is the third one. What's your answerable question about making something better? Is it something that can be proven? Is it something that if you were to implement it as a research arm or whatever your driver is, do you have this core research saying that based on this question that I'm trying to investigate, you can actually have measurable results that could point to either your measurements of betterment being either employment where underemployment or unemployment persisted? Is it land use? Is it land ownership? These are just things I'm just sort of spitballing, but the researcher or whoever I would be advising would have to be very specific about what that is. The fourth piece, I think, would be to recognize that the sum of the three that I just mentioned is not going to be a nice equation. It might not be something you can answer. It might only open up more questions that lead to future research. And then what does that become? If we're talking about putting information out there, the key piece to the fourth component in my mind is your audience. Are you talking to developers, and do those developers that you're engaging really need to be educated on, or are they already with the times, if you will? Or are they sophisticated enough to understand both sides of the argument? So there's a piece of that comes to the practical part of putting land deals together to actually allow buildings to occur, which is the basis of some of this. Before it even becomes gentrification, it has to become a land deal. Someone has to surrender the land in order to give it up for another use. In certain areas, like parts of China, that's not such a big deal because the state owns everything. But in the United States, especially in Boston, the micro parcels, there's parking lots that have 24 owners that own small slivers of a parking lot that you have to get consensus from all 24 if you wanted to buy the parking lot. Like, you have to understand who your audience is and what pool they swim in. And that would be my advice. And that could tailor a really sharp argument. Like, if you found that say nonprofit housing corporations need more this or that. You could tailor an argument and try to structure a question around that piece. Could you look at a model like Skid Row Housing Trust in Los Angeles that's dedicated to supportive housing for homeless and recently homeless or transitioning homeless populations? Could you say that from a development standpoint that a nonprofit such as that needs either more resources or more this or more that to expand that model? It almost comes down to like that fourth piece needs to be like, what interests you? Is it one aspect of building and developing, or is it the entire pie? And I would say to make a stronger research argument, you want to be as narrow as possible. And when you sum up all those pieces, you could almost just lay them out on like who the major players are. You need to get in front of them and find out why things have been the way they have been. I guess the fifth piece I left out is just time. Like over what stretch of time, what's the time frame of the argument and of the research? If you're looking at something such as gentrification, you'd be hard pressed to make a compelling argument based on 4 or 5 years. You'd have to look at 30, 50 years, 100 years, or use major milestones such as in recent history, the last 80 years, you could talk about the Great Depression. From the Great Depression onward, what did we see? That's something that's measurable. So that helps you narrow the focus, and then you could divide it up into chapters and say the Great Depression, then post-World War II, then Vietnam. You could say it like that. Major events, the Kennedy assassination, you could say like, what are these turning points or these moments that cause certain things to change and certain people's viewpoints to change? Is it a major piece of legislation? Well, that all is tied to time. So I hope that answers kind of the question. And looking at what makes something better is so layered that you have to be really specific if you want to be credible.
So if you were in a position to advise the city and legislators, what would you say?
Let's step outside of Boston and let's take where I currently live in Lowell, Massachusetts. Where I would advise is first, let's acknowledge there's a problem. And I want people in the room that acknowledge it's a problem. But I do want to hear from the other side, but I don't want it to come at the expense of moving something forward, which is one piece of gentrification, moving something forward, not staying stagnant. In Lowell, there's pieces of neighborhoods that are in transition. There are some that have a history, recent and a storied history of decline. Some of it's tied to manufacturing, some of it's tied to just situational and environmental factors. So if we have an accord on that, and if we have resources, how much money are we talking about and who are we trying to bring to the table and what are we trying to do? Are we trying to sort of boil the ocean or drink from the water, or drink from the fire hydrant, as they say, like all those cliches? Are we looking at very specific block by block incremental change? Are we saying that the one stretch of Lowell that's on the south side of the Merrimack between the library and Jack Kerouac Park needs help? If we have an accord that says yes, then what can be done? And then those other pieces could fall into place. That would be my advice. Recognize the opportunities. If there's not already, which there are many in certain city planning divisions, if the funding is still available for stuff like that, those opportunity zones have already been defined, and I don't really have to tell them. There would be no advice given if they already recognize that these 12, 13 places need help. The advice would be like, well, who from the private sector can help us out? What public monies are available to help move the thing forward? But are we keen on a certain demographic benefiting, and is it coming at the expense of someone else? And just being wise about those decisions would be my only advice, because a lot of that information is already there. If by chance leaders in Lowell just don't know or are not aware, that's a whole other conversation. It's like, well, we need to get you aligned with resources so that you can unpack the problems and identify the problems, do master planning and identify these zones and figure out what money can be spent and how long will it take to make improvements and what do those improvements look like, who benefits, who builds. It comes back down to those fundamental questions. Yeah. But I think for Boston, I mean, Boston is a very mature city, and I've seen presentations by, from the city of Boston to community groups. So it's not many opportunity zones that, if any, that are unknown. It's some of these peripheral areas, like where I live in Lowell and Lawrence and things like that. So there's initiatives from private companies and nonprofits that say, using labels like sort of legacy cities and stuff like that. There's initiatives where they already recognize that cities like Holyoke and Lawrence and Lowell need help just with the guidance of finding what the problem is. Not just saying like the whole city is bad. It's just saying there's areas that are in transition that need help. What resources are available to tackle very specific problems. That would be my advice. Like, do you guys know what problems exist? And then let's go from there.
So that means investing more into, let's say, research and bringing more architects and planners to the table, or probably create positions for architects or to your knowledge, if there's a 2030 plan for Lowell. I know there's one for Boston.
There's one for Boston, yeah.
Yeah, but I've been bidding. Now I'm bidding on 2 projects in Lowell, and that's pretty nice. I've visited it now 3 times right now, and with Lowell Housing Authority, and great projects that I really enjoyed seeing the work they're doing. It's nice, but it's on very small. Let's say if there's a city and we want to improve the economic environment for the whole city and for the vulnerable communities, what kind of advice as an architect and probably planner to advise cities and how to alleviate that pressure or that inherited lack of resources or lack of.
So is a question really about like resource management of what they currently have, or is it pursuing other avenues?
So usually, let's say in schools, or at least when I heard that from other people, in architectural school, we say like, well, diversity, of course, create diversity, bring different communities, then you're gonna have better economy in the city because you have different ages, different probably unit sizes. But from more extensive research and these talks with other people who've been in the real world and specifically talking about gentrification, I understand now that talking about diversity as a solution is like putting a Band-Aid on for a cancer patient. So it's not
right.
So if we want to look deeper, how to revive these areas economically, other than saying give them diversity.
Yeah, that's definitely a robust question. It's got some fiber to it. It's very nutrient rich. I would say, well, there's a diversification that needs to meet the moment that is not necessarily based on race or social class. It's just about resource diversification of portfolios and sort of the development talk, and where the money's coming from.
And where is it going to?
And where's it going? And so what I learned in my research and putting the dissertation together on different housing projects, as I landed on my Atlanta case, which was the Centennial Place apartments in Atlanta that were built right before the 1996 Olympic Games. This was quasi-public housing, if you will. It had a public housing component to market rate housing. And the money to put that project together reinforced a larger social goal about the community. It was diversification of who lived there and who would benefit from housing such as this in the center of the city. Was the tone that was set by Renee Glover, who was the executive director of the Atlanta Housing Authority, but also reinforced by the mayor, reinforced by the governor, reinforced by those who invested private dollars into the project, major banking institutions put money into that project, knowing where it was going. It was going, one big chunk beyond housing was making a better school, a charter school that children in the housing development could walk to. It was their neighborhood school. And it turned out being one of the top schools in the entire state of Georgia. So when we talk about diversity, there's a diversification that needs to meet the moment that I'm not sure is always there. It's, without looking at very specific portfolios of developers and specific projects, the money coming from a source that is recognizing the social implications of its actions or whatever construction is going to happen is very important to reinforcing the diversity aims of the major players behind the project that are the cheerleaders, the sort of flag bearers, if you will, torch bearers. So that's kind of, be wary of where the dollars are coming from. With any advice I would say, you could have a bottom line that says we need $10 million. If you get it from an organization that doesn't necessarily align their values with yours, then you're going to be in trouble because there's going to be conflicts as soon as that money is exchanged. And in a small way, I'm dealing with that at my job now. When we're talking about where the money is going and who is it going to when we contract out to do work, my push has been, let's not just look at a firm's racial diversity on paper. Let's look at the communities they serve. Let's look at how our contractors are dispersing the money. Let's look at the diversity of opportunities that have been presented. What sort of representation is brought into play here? Like, do you have female senior project managers, project executives? Are you working in underserved communities? Are you investing in the education and training of the youth? Like, what kind of portfolio do you have beyond putting nice buildings together? And that's kind of where I'm going. It's like when we speak about diversity and where the money is coming from, it needs to align with these other goals. And it's harder to do, and it's a slower process, but in my mind, it's much more rewarding.
It is. And yeah, that's a great advice. At first, set your values and try to align the people you work with your values. And I like that. I think that would really work. And we'll help each other figure it out together.
Yep.
We don't know the answers, but we can find the answers.
Certainly.
Well, thank you, and you can share your closing thought. I think that was great, very rich, and I think I'll revisit your paper again.
Yeah, if you want to, for my dissertation, it's a lot richer than that article. I could send you the link. It's through ProQuest. I think the fee is, I think it's like $40 just to access the PDF. So now that it's in ProQuest land, I've been advised not to just give it away. I have to if someone wants to read it, they have to access it.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Vaghn. I really appreciate it. And I'm so excited about publishing